Israel, unless they are able to get into Rafah and deal with Hamas there, they will not have achieved the victory that they need to achieve. And it's extremely important they do that for I think for two main reasons. One, because while they remain a kind of terrorist organized presence in any part of Gaza, they present a threat to Israel, to Israeli civilians, either through rocket attacks or attempts again to get through the border. And secondly, I think it's very important because it also, the defeat of Hamas will send a message to Hezbollah in the north, who are also threatening Israel. And if they see that Hamas has been taken apart, I think it's more likely to deter them from intensifying their aggression against Israel, even beyond the level it's at now. And in recent days, they fired, for example, a barrage of 80 rockets from Lebanon into Israel in just one relatively short time.
How would you assess the success of the IDF's military operation in Gaza? And also, how would you assess that current Hezbollah threat?
The IDF have been very successful in Gaza so far. They've killed a very large number of Hamas terrorists. They've taken apart the bulk of the Hamas terrorist machinery so that it now is no longer operating as a kind of full-scale terror army across Gaza. It now is operating more as individuals and maybe very small groups, which can be taken care of relatively easily, except for the Rafah area, where there's still at least 2 battalions of Hamas that are able to act more decisively against the IDF. So I think they've done a pretty effective job, and all that at the relatively low cost of Israeli military casualties. We're in excess of 240 now, but compared to around about 15,000 Hamas killed, about 4,000 captured, and probably about 15,000 seriously wounded or thereabouts, I think that's a major damage to the Hamas organization, and compares very favorably with the tragic but fortunately not too high level of IDF casualties. And at the same time, they've been doing all they can to minimize civilian casualties. And that's very tough in a fight where Hamas is trying to maximize the number of civilian casualties on their own side. I think we should give proper credit to the IDF for doing all they can to minimize those civilian casualties. Despite that, in that environment where Hamas is trying to force them to kill civilians by hiding behind human shields, of course, a large number of civilians have unfortunately died. In the north, Hezbollah, I think, have considered a major offensive against Israel in coordination with Hamas, but decided against it. I think they decided against it fairly early on. And it goes to my point about the need to destroy Hamas, to deter Hezbollah, because Iran and Hezbollah, and of course Iran control Hezbollah, they don't want to see that they don't want to lose their terror army in the north in Lebanon. And so I think they'll be reluctant, we don't know, but I think they'll be reluctant to launch a major offensive. And meanwhile, they have been firing a lot of rockets, anti-tank weapons, drones, etc., at Israeli civilian and military targets. And the Israelis have been doing severe damage to Hezbollah, or particularly around the Lebanon border, where they've taken out large quantities of their weapon systems. They've killed quite a few Hezbollah terrorists. I think the last count I heard was something like 260, 270 Hezbollah terrorists. And of course, they've struck deeper into Lebanon as well to target terrorist leaders there. So that's not the solution to the problem. The problem can't be solved unless Hezbollah either voluntarily withdraws northwards under diplomatic pressure, which doesn't appear to be on the cards at the moment, or they're forced to do so by a much more intensive Israeli campaign against them, which I think is probably on the cards sometime maybe around the next few weeks, as the weather has improved and allows the Israelis to take maximum advantage of their technical sophistication in dealing with Hezbollah. Up until now, it's been much more difficult to take on Hezbollah, particularly on the ground, but also from the air in a concerted way, given the weather conditions.
What might that action look like? You mentioned from the air. if the weather improves?
Well, I think what we're talking about probably is a very intensive air campaign against Hamas, against Hezbollah's military assets in Lebanon, as well as the terrorist leaders and terrorist fighters themselves. Probably coordinated with a ground offensive as well, because it's very difficult to eliminate a threat just from the air in these circumstances. And I think it's going to be a very tough fight, because Hezbollah is not Hamas. They're a much stronger, more capable terrorist organization than Hamas. And we've seen, it's taken the IDF nearly 5 months already, and they still haven't destroyed Hamas. So it might take a comparable length of time or even longer to deal with Hezbollah. Very hard to say. And the other point we shouldn't forget is that it's going to be very painful for Israel as well. Not only having to fight two wars, possibly two wars at the same time, but certainly maybe a less intensive war inside Gaza at the same time as destroying or attacking Hezbollah in Lebanon. But it's going to be painful as well from the actions that Hezbollah are capable of carrying out. They've got about 150,000 missiles in Lebanon, give or take. Some of them are precision-guided weapons, which can do great damage to specific Israeli targets. And some of them reach right down the entire length of Israel. So I think potentially, cities like Tel Aviv could easily come under serious attack from Hezbollah. And of course, that will be mitigated by the Iron Dome and the Israelis' other air defense systems. But it will also, I think, in order to minimize the damage to Israel, will require a pretty intensive air campaign right from the word go.
Returning to Hamas in Gaza, how close do you think the IDF are in terms of taking out the leadership, such as Yahya Sinwar, who today we're hearing details of how he used to kill people by burying them alive in concrete? How disgusted are you at those kind of stories, and how close do you think Israel's defense forces are in getting to the leaders of
Sinwar? The reports about Sinwar's bestiality don't come as a surprise, and that is not necessarily even the worst thing he's done to his victims over the course of his career. He's a very vicious, psychopathic individual, but also at the same time a pretty sophisticated military leader who, of course, had a major role in the 7th of October. And I think that shows the level of his sophistication and the people working with him. The IDF have come close, I believe, to him a few times during this campaign. They've in one case, I think they were at a place where he had been a very short time after he'd left. So they've come close to him. But of course, he, as I understand it now, is focused much more on his own survival than on coordinating Hamas as a terrorist entity. And therefore, he's probably going to be quite a tricky target to get hold of. We would have planned all this long ago, using the tunnel systems, etc. And of course, he will be surrounding himself, I've no doubt at all, by hostages to make Israel's job of getting hold of him. And the same goes to some of the other senior leaders of Hamas as well. It's going to be tough to get hold of him. I'd be pretty confident that they reach him and deal with him. And if they don't, if he does manage to escape, and I think that's possibly on the cards, that he could get out through Egypt perhaps, and then I would expect that he would be hunted down in subsequent months, possibly even years, until justice is administered to him.
The likes of David Cameron have been renewing calls for Israel to do more in terms of getting aid into Gaza. How much weight do you think there is in that argument? And is it Israel's responsibility to make this happen when it appears that Hamas are stealing the aid that comes in and using it for terror purposes?
Well, of course, it's a difficult balance that Israel has. And they have no obligation to allow in materials into a combat zone that can be used to fight against them. But then that has to be balanced with the moral aspects of doing their best to help feed the population of Gaza, which is apparently going quite hungry at the moment. So we're told. I don't know. I've not seen the population firsthand. I don't know what condition they're in, but we're told they are very hungry. But Israel has been doing everything it can to facilitate the aid coming into Gaza. And my understanding now is that the blockage in aid is not on the Israeli side, but on the Gaza side, where it's proving very difficult to get aid, logistically difficult to get aid out to the population, particularly in the north. And also the fact that Hamas is seizing a great deal of it. And in some cases, as I understand it, aid which is delivered free by international donors is being sold at significant profit to the population by Hamas once they get their hand on it in some cases. But Israel, I think, is doing what it can. Of course, we've seen airdrops from the US and other countries, which has made a bit of a difference, but I don't think there's a significant difference to the amount of aid coming in through airdrops. Obviously, there's a limit to how much you can do of that. And now we're hearing about the possibility of a temporary port being built, which will again be a useful source of aid coming in from Cyprus across the Mediterranean to this port. That will probably help. But again, what happens when it gets onto the shores of Gaza? Again, it will come under it. There's no real option other than for it to come under the control of Hamas. And so the same will happen really as the aid coming in over land. I think one issue that people have not really considered, as far as I can see, as extensively as they should have done, is the question of Egypt. And of course, there is the possibility of Egypt opening up its borders and allowing refugees from Rafah to leave Gaza and go and take refuge inside Egypt. The international community and the Egyptian authorities are more than capable of constructing facilities for refugees in Sinai. And it's a very viable option. The problem is, I can understand in a way why Egypt doesn't want it. And Egypt reinforced its border with Gaza, in particularly in recent weeks. They don't want the problems that the Gazan population is going to bring to them. But on the other hand, again, looking at it from the moral perspective, perhaps they should be pressured to do so. And many arguments around that come from people who say, yeah, but you're facilitating the expulsion of the population from Gaza, which is what Israel wants. Well, Israel doesn't want that. Israel's objective is to get the hostages freed and to destroy Hamas, not to expel the population from Gaza. And it seems to me that if people were actually serious about, and when I say people, I'm talking about the international community, the media, the UN, human rights groups, if they're actually serious about their concerns that Israel is committing a genocide inside Gaza, which is not the case, but that's the allegation, then you think they might actually prioritize human life over their fears of the removal of the population from Gaza. Many Gazans want to get out of Gaza. They want to go to Egypt to take at least temporary refuge, and that currently is closed off.
You mentioned the aid groups, and in recent weeks, we've had more detail about potential members of UNRWA being involved in the October 7th massacres. And a lot of donations were being paused for a period of time whilst investigations continue. A couple of countries, I think Sweden and Canada, have decided to resume donations. What's your take on that organization and its credibility?
Well, I think that it's no surprise what we've been hearing about UNRWA in recent weeks, particularly their complicity in terrorist activity, active participation in some cases, vocal support in other cases. But we know also that UNRWA is effectively an arm of Hamas. The aid and the assistance that UNRWA has given over many decades now to people in Gaza is done under the control of Hamas. And one of the concerning things about it, of course, is the way they educate Gazan children in their school, and by doing that they perpetuate the hatred of Israel. Of course, there's an innate hatred of Israel and Jews inside Gaza, but it's not really for a UN organization that we fund to make that even worse, which is what they've been doing by their education, which even further radicalizes children inside Gaza, and also under its policy of giving perpetual refugee status to Palestinians, which is a unique thing in the world. Generally speaking, after a conflict, if people have fled a particular zone and become refugees, they become integrated in that society or a separate society, and their refugee status ends. But there are generation after generation of refugees. Ever since 1948, successive generations have acquired refugee status under UNRWA auspices, so that, if you were born in the US, but you're born to Palestinian parents or grandparents, you are a refugee, even though you live in the US and have US citizenship. So these are some of the things that UNRWA has been responsible for, effectively radicalizing the population, supporting Hamas, and perpetuating the conflict. And I think it certainly is time that they were packed up and replaced by something that's less a contributor to this terrible conflict.
And these false narratives are being added to and perpetuated by Iran and the IRGC. How concerned are you that the world still doesn't seem quite ready to deal with Iran in a meaningful way? There is a US election coming up in November between Biden and Trump, it looks like. How do you see things playing out in terms of a meaningful action against Tehran?
Well, let's not forget what Tehran is responsible for. Apart from making immense progress towards acquiring its own bomb, which is very close, its own nuclear bomb, which is very close to now, and all the inherent dangers that brings with it. In addition to that, of course, they terrorize their own population. They oppress their own population in a way that is more extreme, certainly, than most countries in the world, even the most repressive dictatorships. They are also responsible for a network of violent proxies around the region, which includes Hamas in Gaza, Islamic Jihad in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, various proxies inside Iraq, Syria, which have been trying to attack Israel, the Houthis in Yemen, proxies in Iraq and in Syria, which have been attacking US forces, numerous, over 600, I think, attacks against US forces just since this war began, with very little response from the US. And I think that in itself tells us a story which kind of leads to the answer of your question, which is that the West, led by the US, is actually doing the opposite of trying to deal with this global or this regional threat. And actually, incidentally, it is also a global threat because Iran has proxies and terrorist operations all around the world, including in the UK, including in the rest of Europe and the US. And it's being facilitated. It's being, in a way, being encouraged by unfreezing of frozen Iranian assets by the Biden administration almost since he took office. A refusal, for example, in Britain to prescribe the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist body, and the IRGC, part of the Iranian government, is the people that are organizing all these proxies, directing them, arming them, funding them. Yet still they go unprescribed by the UK. So I think, that a great deal of the violence in the Middle East is not going to end until the West properly confronts Iran, and it's not doing so now and shows no sign of doing so.
And what is proper confronting? What does that constitute?
Certainly there should be severe retaliation against Iran for the violence that it's caused in the region. And by that, I don't mean bombing in empty bits of desert and saying we've retaliated for an Iranian attack against US forces, which tends to be the pattern. And I don't see it as being kind of less than forceful attacks against the Houthis, despite the immense disruption they've been doing to world trade through attacks on international shipping up the Red Sea. I would see it as being direct attacks against Iranian assets like the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps on Iranian territory. And I think severe attacks like that would probably help to destabilize the Iranian government. And I think what is needed is for, I hate to say it because it's not necessarily been overly successful in other areas, but there is a need for regime change. This government does need to come down. If it doesn't come down, if it's not brought down in some way, preferably by resistance from within Iran, of which there is quite a bit, which could be supported more, I think this violence will just continue. This government in Iran will not change its spots in any way without being taken out of power. And I think, as I say, that could be contributed to by direct strikes against Iranian government infrastructure.